Good afternoon again. I'd like to start with an example before I get going. So a number of you may know this person. This is a very famous Dutch writer, AFT von der Heijden, who lost his son a number of years ago. So his son was biking through Amsterdam and he was hit by a car. And AFT wrote a book about his son who was called Tonio. What I want to talk about is an interview that AFT gave. That was actually the first interview after the death of his son 2 years later. And in the interview, he was asked, do you blame the driver for the death of your son? And he said, well, the driver is to blame, my son is to blame, but ultimately this was just fate. And that's what I want to talk about today. These kinds of ultimate attributions that people make for negative life events, such as the death of a child. So AFT attributed this to fate. That was his ultimate attribution. I want to talk about what kinds of causes or dimensions people see as responsible for justice or injustice. So the death of a child, we social psychologists would call a fairly unjust event. And to introduce you into my ideas, I want to actually go back to the 1980s when Lerner started thinking about this issue and asked himself how people cope with injustices. So for example, a doctor who works at a hospital and sees children dying untimely on a fairly daily basis and parents suffering. How do people live with these kinds of injustices and nevertheless see life as having meaning, as making sense? And he came up with a concept that some of you may be quite familiar with the idea that ultimately the world is just and fair. And so there's been quite a lot of research done on this, and we know that people have, to a stronger or lesser extent, this fundamental idea that the world can potentially be fair and just, and that helps you also deal with smaller or bigger injustices in life. And what I want to talk about is actually a question that we've been asking ourselves. So if we see the world as just, which we know now that most people do, what actually is the world? So people who say, well, the world is just would agree to items like people get what they deserve and, well, the world is just. But what is the world, and who are the people who are saying you get, or who is giving what you deserve? So who are really these ultimate entities that are responsible for justice or injustice? And so AFT in a way has helped along the way, because one of the options that he gives is fate. So fate could be the cause of injustices in life. And we sat down to think of all the potential ones that we could come up with. And I'm pretty sure we haven't come up with all the possible dimensions of injustice, but these are the ones we have so far. So we had the idea that when you're confronted with injustice, you could either see, or important life events, you can see them as caused by God. So this is just God's path for me in life. You can see them as caused by chance. What happens to me in life is fairly random. Good things happen, bad things happen. You can see them as caused by nature. What happens in life is just a natural process. Or by other people, for example, human institutions, or just the people in your environment. Or you can think that you yourself are responsible for whether or not you experience negative life events. So we designed a scale to measure these 6 dimensions and to see whether they really are the kinds of sources of justice that people hold responsible. And we've administered this scale many, many times now, and every time we do find indeed that we have these 6 separate dimensions that are very reliable, that people see as sources of injustice. So I was actually really, really happy when we came up with this idea. But of course, it's interesting to think about why this would be consequential. So why is it important to have this knowledge? And well, there's a lot of work to be done, but I just want to focus on 2 parts here, I hope. Oh yeah, yes. Yeah. So one is that it affects how people interpret important life events. So we have life events that have fairly objective causes. For example, if a tornado hits the world, that's something you would objectively say is probably due to nature. If you bike through a red traffic light and you're hit by a car, well, then that was probably a bit your own fault. If you experience earthquakes in northeast Groningen, you could say that that is to a large extent the fault of the NUM. So we have objective ways of interpreting this kind of situation, but what we see in our research is that the dimensions that you hold responsible for justice will affect how you interpret these kinds of situations. So let me give an example. If we talk about earthquakes and we would ask people what is ultimately responsible for these earthquakes, you would say, well, that should be probably the NUM. But what we would find, I would expect we'd find in our research, is that people give attributions or perceptions that are consistent with their sources of injustice. So if I think that I myself am responsible largely for injustice, I'd be more likely to focus on aspects like, well, you know, I did move to that region, or I should have got out when I could. So in a way, I'm partly responsible for the situation I am in right now. So what we find, and we've looked at this across many different types of events, from tornadoes to biking through a red traffic light, is really that people make very consistent interpretations of these life events. And I want to just give you another one that also shows why this is societally relevant. What we also did was, ask people about criminal behavior. So what causes criminal behavior? So looking at whether we can see whether people have different interpretations of causes of criminal behavior. And you can think of things like, well, it could be genes, it can just be taking the wrong turn in life, it can be just you yourself, you know, you should not be criminal. And so we asked people to give reasons for why they think someone becomes a criminal. And again, we find responses that are very consistent with these dimensions here. So if you think that chance is a source of injustice in general, then you're more likely to say, well, this guy just took the wrong turn in life. Whereas if you think that nature is the source of injustice, you're more likely to say it's just bad genes. And this is actually quite consequential. I mean, we've shown in our research that it affects the extent to which you want to help a criminal person reintegrate into society. So if you think it's their own fault, you're less likely to want to help them than if you think that there's a genetic reason or bad parental upbringing, which would be another person-related reason. But another aspect in which these sources of injustice and in the situation of criminal behavior are important is, for example, if you think about decision making. So what kind of punishment would you give a criminal person? If you think that it's their own fault, you're more likely to think that you would give a much higher punishment than if you, for example, think there's a genetic cause for this. And we've seen court cases like this. So in Italy, there was a court case of a criminal who pleaded less guilty because he had a genetic defect that made him more prone to aggressive behavior, or he scored high on a gene. And in this case, his sentence was reduced. And so I'm not saying that I could have predicted the outcome of such a court case, but with this scale, what we can say is how the kinds of ways that people will interpret behavior, interpret life events, and also what kind of behaviors they're more or less likely to engage in. And so I started out with talking about AFTH and his attribution to fate. And I'm ending here with saying, well, these sources of justice are important for how we interpret life events and the kinds of behaviors we engage in. If we come back to these traumatic life events, which is actually something that I'm hoping to study in the coming few years, then I would say that we can probably, with this scale, predict the kinds of interpretations people give. So to what extent they're more prone to interpret the death of a child as more likely due to fate, or a little more prone to interpreting such an outcome as due to their own fault, possibly. And of course, that will depend a lot on the type of traumatic event people experience. But we do know already in the trauma literature that people have a very wide range of interpretations for trauma. And so I'm very interested in looking at whether we can explain some of the reasons or the directions of their interpretation with this scale. And also, we expect that this would affect how people cope and adjust to such a traumatic event. So just to finalize, I hope that for today I've raised your interest a little or shown you why it's interesting to think about who people see as ultimately responsible for important outcomes in their life, and that this can really influence how they perceive events around them and the kinds of behaviors and activities they engage in response to these events. Thank you for your attention.